Can history be rewritten? Can all the information embedded in our minds be erased, and a completely different history be written? Will social memory adapt to this? Is history slowly being distorted? Yes, just as planned. Yes, countless states and countless leaders have done this many times throughout history. It is being done now, and it will be done tomorrow. Today in America, for example, statues of Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers of the country, are being removed, and history is being rewritten on a micro scale right before our eyes. For example, they are trying to change the past according to today's values and conditions. Is this the most misguided and reckless thing imaginable? Unfortunately, yes. If you don't accept history as it is, objectively, with its rights and wrongs, those who distort it today will easily distort it tomorrow as well. Anyway, these efforts have given rise to incredible stories and legends, myths that cost millions of lives in history, theories and approaches based on pseudoscience. Let's examine and discuss them together. Of course, the most famous one is well known. The Nazis based their superiority on eugenics and, consequently, on Darwin's theory of evolution. No matter where you start, it falls apart in our hands. Because, unfortunately, the world and our opportunities today were written in blood and presented to us. You actually know the Ahnenerbe. Where from? At least we are familiar with popular culture, the Marvel Universe, and so on. Yes, Indiana Jones. For example, in Raiders of the Lost Ark, there is the character Arnold Ernst Todt, who plays a Nazi Gestapo agent and races Indiana Jones to find the Ark of the Covenant. Or Johann Schmidt, who became Red Skull in the Marvel Universe, was also fighting the Avengers to seize the Tesseract. He was a former SS officer too. Paula von Gunther in Wonder Woman was also fighting Wonder Woman with her magical powers. These are actually the source of a large part of these stories. Ahnenerbe is a word meaning, you must have heard of one of its founders in particular, Heinrich Himmler, one of the chief architects of the Holocaust. The others were various unusual characters. Herman Wirth, for example, was a Dutch historian obsessed with the lost continent of Atlantis. Richard Walter Dahr was the originator of the Blut und Boden, or blood and soil theory. It was one of the Nazis' most powerful slogans, emphasizing the superiority of the pure race living on certain lands. Dahr was also head of the SS Race and Settlement Main Office. This trio would establish the Ahnenerbe in 1935. And Himmler, who became head of the Schutzstaffel, SS, a paramilitary organization founded by Hitler, and known literally as the Protection Squad, would immediately integrate this secret organization into the SS in 1940. Himmler had one significant characteristic. He was a person who wholeheartedly believed in mysterious, supernatural research. One of the satellites collided with Earth, causing the destruction of Atlantis. According to some German occultists, the divine beings they called Aryans, whom they believed to be of Scandinavian origin, fled Atlantis and spread across different regions of German territory. They believed that the German race was the purest race, descended from these divine, pure Nordic gods. They believed that all non-German subraces should recognize this and submit. But of course, proof was needed. To this end, Himmler began sending some of the names he had included in the Ahnenerbe around the world to find evidence. The evidence consisted of archaeological excavations, ancient artifacts, ancient stories, legends, and linguistic origin studies that could be viewed as scientific. He commissioned numerous studies in the Scandinavian countries. In one of these, in 1936, he sent a young Finn, Björn von Granhagen, to Finland. Granhagen returned with excerpts from the Kalevala epic, written during the rise of nationalism in Finland following the country's declaration of independence from Russia in 1917, and images of witches performing pagan rituals. Himmler was very pleased and his excitement was renewed. By expanding these studies further, archaeologists, anthropologists, musicologists, and linguists would be sent to Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, South America, and even the Himalayas. Experts collecting ancient artifacts in these regions directly attributed the more advanced items to the Aryans. Linguists, refuting the hieroglyphics in Egypt, dated writings found in Sweden to 12,000 years ago, claiming that the oldest writing systems were also developed by the Aryans. Varsailthi prepared carefully crafted images, films, and documentaries to educate the masses. But the evidence was insufficient. More solid evidence was still needed. First, history had to be distorted and altered. Roman civilization, for example, stood very strongly in history. They needed to link this civilization to the Aryans as well. And Metin, in 1937, archaeologist Franz Altheim and his photographer wife Erika Trautmann discovered Nordic symbols in prehistoric wall paintings in Italy, which they would link to the Aryans having founded Rome. Varsail and Metin. Now, these studies seem like empty, meaningless endeavors, don't they? Well, there's no doubt that's the case. But we'll see what changing history and, most importantly, convincing the public of it will lead to. But as a final step, the Ahnenerbe's real target was, of course, places like Iceland, which were thought to be the homeland of this race. That's why they organized trips to Iceland. They were searching for medieval Edda texts believed to describe the weapons and medicines of ancient, advanced civilizations. According to Himmler, Solon II actually pointed to a real, usable energy source. And it didn't stop there. A large portion of the Nazis believed that Bigfoot, known as Yetis, was also one of the lost rings. A young zoologist named Ernst Schaefer would go to Tibet to search for traces of this as well. Subsequently, during expeditions to Tibet, Tibetan beliefs and the anatomical characteristics of the people were researched. And all this data and discoveries were brought together. Piece by piece, this so-called history, which was inconsistent and had no basis, was ready to be transformed into reality. Subsequently, during expeditions to Tibet, Tibetan beliefs and the anatomical characteristics of the people were researched. And all this data and discoveries were brought together. Piece by piece, this so-called history, which was inconsistent and had no basis, was ready to be transformed into reality. Yes, even though there was no direct connection between the German race and the so-called Aryan gods, and even though there was no evidence for the existence of the Aryan race itself, Himmler had enough evidence at his disposal and was ready to compile it and launch his propaganda campaign. Designed academic publications and the magazine Germanen began to instill this consciousness in the German people. In fact, it was the propaganda aimed at the public, rather than these so-called expeditions, that would have the real impact. For example, objects and artifacts belonging to German culture, discovered in lands supposedly occupied by inferior races, were seen as sufficient justification for the occupation of those lands. Of course, the Ahnenerbe Military Scientific Research Institute, especially targeting Jews, had also found reasons to conduct experiments on people. It was extremely cruel that they had justified this situation. For example, Professor August Hirt and a group of ethnologists returned from an expedition to Tibet in 1938 with over 100 skeletons. But one of the most horrific Ahnenerbe experiments would be carried out by Dr. Sigmund Rasche, a medical officer in the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. For example, Professor August Hirt and a group of ethnologists returned from an expedition to Tibet in 1938 with over 100 skeletons. But one of the most horrific Ahnenerbe experiments would be carried out by Dr. Sigmund Rasche, a medical officer in the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. He was truly one of the most diabolical figures in the SS. Could you say there was anything worse than that? I don't think so. In one experiment, he put prisoners of war in a freezer, then tested whether they could be revived using sleeping bags and hot water. He was truly one of the most diabolical figures in the SS. Could you say there was anything worse than that? I don't think so. In one experiment, he put prisoners of war in a freezer, then tested whether they could be revived using sleeping bags and hot water. He applied this as a revival method by having them engage in intercourse with frozen bodies. Some frozen people did indeed come back to life, most likely because they hadn't completely lost their lives. However, this wasn't good for them, because those who revived were then shot. Rasche, who was Himmler's right-hand man, and married to one of Himmler's relatives, had also carried out countless inhumane experiments. These were not experiments we could imagine. Most were so savage and cruel that they would make us lose our sanity. However, in the end, as a result of his own actions, he would be found arrested by the SS. Apparently, Rasche and his wife, who had 3 children, had actually kidnapped these children. Furthermore, after it was revealed that he had killed his laboratory assistant, embezzled money, and deceived Himmler by mixing countless tricks into his experiments, he was sentenced to death. I think this death could even be a victory for him, because the execution of the person responsible for the deaths of millions would be nothing but salvation for him. Even before these events, there were those within the SS who opposed the efforts and methods of the Ahnenerbe. The cultural policy and oversight agency called Amt Rosenberg, founded by Alfred Rosenberg, opposed the work of the Ahnenerbe. It rejected such efforts based on witchcraft and pseudoscience. Essentially, the Ahnenerbe's attempts to completely eradicate Christianity from Germany and replace it with its own beliefs had finally come to an end. The attempt to create an artificial culture based on pseudoscience and pseudo-history had failed, and by 1945, the Ahnenerbe, whose headquarters were in Weichenfeld at the time, had been consigned to history. Although most of the center was destroyed, a considerable amount of documentation was seized, revealing the organization's activities. Subsequently, individuals implicated by these documents were prosecuted. However, according to some rumors, many who had conducted horrific experiments continued to live under assumed names, and even continued their work in academia and healthcare. In summary, the dusty pages of history are filled with stories that seem very strange to us today, yet directly affected the lives of millions of people. Learning these stories is invaluable to us in designing our future, so we do not repeat the same mistakes. We hope that such insane societies and communities never exist in this world. And as always, until we meet again, thank you for being here. Best regards.